really only the next 6 months, they're going to have to agree to some very tough terms in terms of scope and pace of what's going to happen.
And when things aren't written down, North Korea doesn't adhere to them. Remember in 2012,
maybe they just have some verbal assurances. That's clearly not enough.
So what should we be looking for in these follow-on negotiations?
I think one of the first things that they need to do is define what is meant by denuclearization.
Clearly there has to be strong international verification over time on that facility.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. After meeting with Chairman Kim Jong-un, President Trump said North Korea no longer poses a nuclear threat to the United States. Secretary of State said U.S. hopes to achieve a major disarmament of North Korean nuclear arsenal during President Trump's first term in office, that is, by the end of 2020. How should the U.S. strategize and proceed with the follow-on denuclearization talks with North Korea?
We believe that Chairman Kim Jong-un understands the urgency of the timing of completing this denuclearization, that he understands that we must do this quickly.
Now my guest today, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick has a 26-year career in the U.S. State Department and was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation. Also joining us today, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks, focusing on Asia security and foreign policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
happy to be here.
Great. President Donald Trump, in the TV interview this morning, again mentioned the accomplishments from the Singapore summit. He said the remains are coming back, that a missile engine test site will be closed, and that Americans are not worried about missile testings anymore. So if any one of you can start us off, in your view, what was the accomplishment from the Singapore summit for the U.S. side?
Well, I think maintaining the diplomatic momentum that President Moon has opened up with Kim Jong-un is the main achievement. And now we have a high-level direct president-to-chairman relationship that opens up a diplomatic space for experts to try to fill in the very, very difficult and important details. And there's a narrow window to do that, really only the next 6 months. They're going to have to agree to some very tough terms in terms of scope and pace of what's going to happen.
And you mentioned about the details, and Secretary Pompeo actually said that there were a lot of understandings reached between the U.S. and North Korean side, just that it was not put down on paper. So how much weight could we put on verbal agreements as opposed to written?
We have to be careful of things that aren't put on paper. We've seen this movie before, and when things aren't written down, North Korea doesn't adhere to them. Remember in 2012, the famous Leap Day deal? It was supposed to stop all long-range missile tests. North Korea then very quickly launched a satellite test. And they said, well, it wasn't in the agreement. And the Americans said, no, we talked about it and it was agreed. It wasn't written down. So I don't place any weight on things that aren't written down.
This is a process, though. It takes some time. I totally agree with Mark. What we may be negotiating right now, and maybe Secretary Pompeo has to go back to Pyongyang to try to wrest out something that will be put into writing. So that's really where this negotiation is at the moment. It may still happen, but we don't have any evidence of that. Maybe they just have some verbal assurances. That's clearly not enough, but maybe it indicates where they'll go in the next few weeks.
Can I add one other thing? You mentioned that some missile test site was to be demolished. Engine test site. We're not quite sure what it means. This is not the right way to do it without international inspectors or without Americans there to see the actual destruction, because there's forensic evidence that will be destroyed. Without having inspectors on the ground, like when that tunnel was collapsed, the tunnels at the nuclear test site, nobody is 100% sure that it was really demolished irreversibly, and then all the equipment and diagnostic equipment and so forth was removed. So they shouldn't just do it without inspectors present.
Right. So we will start the follow-on discussions from as soon as in a couple of days. Secretary Pompeo will be leading this. So what should we be looking for in these follow-on negotiations?
Well, in the next few weeks, after the private conversations occur, we should be hearing from officials what the North Koreans are agreed to do and what concessions we're willing to give them in exchange. And we're going to have to move beyond these sort of goodwill, confidence-building measures of just pause on the exercise in the fall or a missile freeze. We need to get into something very serious in terms of significant disarmament, and it has to be done in the coming 6 months to 2 years, as they promised in the first term of President Trump.
But I think one of the first things that they need to do is define what is meant by denuclearization. In the run-up to the Singapore summit, there was apparently a lot of discussion about that, and they didn't reach an agreement. Does it mean in North Korea's entire nuclear program, including those that are supposedly devoted to civilian purposes? Does it include the delivery systems? And if so, just the long-range missiles or also the short-range missiles? Defining what the goal is, then the next step is North Korea begins to make a declaration of all the parts of the program that will need to be dismantled. But first they have to get a concrete agreement on the goal.
And I think they've been talking about the goal in private, and they don't agree on it. That's the problem. So what they're doing is they're trying to define down that space, the big gap that exists. I think President Trump was hoping to reach that goal at the summit. They didn't reach it. And so President Trump said, Kim's a very good negotiator. I think what he meant by that is he didn't give us his bottom line. So Mike Pompeo now has to lead the effort to work on defining what would be a possible agreement.
So what will be the most difficult part about this whole denuclearization process?
I think the most difficult part will be the verification. North Korea is a very secretive country, and they never appreciated the presence of the international inspectors earlier. They always had clashes with them. They didn't want to reveal, they wouldn't want to allow the inspectors to go where they said they needed to go. And now we've got a much larger set of facilities that need to be inspected, secret enrichment facilities that need to be declared and inspected. And for North Korea to allow that kind of intrusive inspection goes totally against the grain of this secret society. So that's going to be a huge hurdle.
What do you think should be the goals for verifications?
Well,
Dr. Cronin.
the goal for verification ought to be to get to as close as possible the gold standard of any time, anywhere, by anyone the international community chooses, not just a pre-selected person that the North Korean government would approve of. Now, that's not going to be possible, and what Mark Fitzpatrick has just said is the history of North Korea. Even when we worked on food aid deliveries, they wouldn't want international inspectors to guarantee the food was getting to people who were hungry. So you can imagine when they get to nuclear weapons, they're even more sort of risk averse at letting in inspectors. So we're going to have to get as close to that as possible, and that means when we have identified a specific goal, maybe a highly enriched uranium facility to lock up, clearly there has to be strong international verification over time on that facility, and that's just one facility of many.
I think it's probably the anytime, anywhere phrase. We probably need to get away from that because, as Patrick said, we try to get close to it, but it's not going to happen. It's only happened in the case of countries that were defeated in war. In the case of Iraq, they had to accept anytime, anywhere inspections. But in other cases, like the Iran case, President Obama's team one time used this term, anytime, anywhere. And then a criticism of the Iran nuclear deal always said, well, we didn't get anytime, anywhere. Well, you're not going to get that with a sovereign country that still has military bases where it needs to protect its secrets. So there will be a negotiated process in accordance with the procedures of the International Atomic Energy Agency for what can be inspected in a certain time frame for it and so forth, but it's not anytime, anywhere.
And it's not, but it goes back to we don't agree on denuclearization, we don't agree on verification, and so the United States, North Korea are going to try to narrow the gap between what's acceptable. And again, the U.S. position will be to try to get closer to that standard, even though we shouldn't be talking about it as a government. I can talk about it because that's the standard I'd like to get to, because we want to know whether North Korea is truly going to denuclearize.
And there's a great political reel right now because the two leaders have met. So is it useful to have the supreme leader of North Korea sign on to an agreement early in the process, Dr. Cronin?
Well, we don't know until we've tried. We've tried the other way, and that didn't work out well either. So the point is, nothing has worked to date. So let's see if this third generation Kim truly does want to do something different. President Moon says he does. Xi Jinping says he does. So let's try it. So I wouldn't trust the words, but at least test the words. And that's what we're trying to do with this negotiation that now follows the summit in the coming weeks.
And Secretary Pompeo has set the deadline, 2020. So is the pressure now on North Korea to deliver?
Well, the deadline is 2020 because that's the end of the first term of the Trump administration, and he wants accomplishments on which to build a case for re-election. 2 years or 2.5 years is a pretty short period to dismantle all the apparatus of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. The major facilities certainly can be dismantled in that period of time, but I expect that actual dismantlement will take a while to even begin because we first have to go through these negotiations of what is to be declared and dismantled, the verification of the declaration, and this with a society that I said is so secretive and has had so much mutual distrust. Even though the top leaders seem to have hit it off pretty well in Singapore, at the lower level, working with officials who have distrusted each other for so long, 2 years is a very high standard to meet.
So, 2 points on that. One is it's a spectrum that we're trying to negotiate again. We're trying to accomplish as much significant dismantlement in the next 2 years as possible. And that's not just because the Trump administration wants to do that. That's also because in our polity, we will not be able to sustain this process, I think, beyond 2020 if there has not been significant steps taken. So as a practical matter, it's a structural impediment to the completion of this document that is very flimsy, has to be filled in the next 6 months, and then over the next 2 years, something significant has to be done, even if the whole process does take years.
Can I say, though, you look at U.S.-Soviet arms control talks. Nothing was ever done in this short a period of time. It usually took years and years of negotiations, 7 years in the case of SALT talks, for example. So even though there's a political imperative in Washington to get it done quickly, I think that as long as the talks are going on and North Korea is not testing nuclear weapons and not launching missiles, and we're having a diplomatic process, that alone is of value.
It is, but I think Trump will walk away from the deal in 2019 or 2020 if he doesn't see significant.
So we'll end this discussion here and watch video for our next discussion.
Thank you.
So under the circumstances that we're negotiating a very comprehensive, complete deal, I think it's inappropriate to be having war games.
President Trump decided to suspend major U.S. military exercises with South Korea for the duration of talks. U.S. officials explain readiness training and training exchanges will continue. So what's different between large-scale military exercises as opposed to small unit trainings?
Well, the main reason we do major exercises every spring and fall with the South Korean military is to reassure and be ready for all contingencies, but especially the big contingency. If we went to war on the Korean Peninsula tomorrow, would we be willing and able to resupply our limited number of forces and troops and operate at the same time safely? The answer is not without training, not without exercises. And these troops are rotating every year, so they need to be constantly refreshed in their training and exercise.
So why do you think we kept the small training exercises then?
Well, it's absolutely imperative that some training goes on while large exercises are suspended. You can't suspend all training, absolutely. I mean, that would be just so reckless.
You don't need a military if you're going to not have training.
Right.
I mean, soldiers need to be trained. So all we're saying is a large-scale exercise, which is intended for a major conflict on the peninsula, we could pause on that right now. We're in the heat of diplomacy. But eventually, we're going to continue to have lower-level training up to unit level and above eventually.
So how long can this pause be? How to maintain readiness? Can we pause for a year or two?
You know, we've done this before. Back in the 90s, Team Spirit, a major joint exercise, was suspended in 1992, resumed in 93, and then 94 to 96. For 3 years, it was suspended. Now, that was a long time not to have major exercise. I was surprised that it continued that long, but it's been done before, so probably it can, again, continue like that.
And if we just play on that example in history, we, of course, were involved in the agreed framework, the first nuclear deal, essentially, between the United States and North Korea, at least, that eventually fell apart. But we then returned to another exercise that was not called Team Spirit. We gave it a different name. We reduced the number of troops involved because we didn't need all those troops. And we went to more computerized exercises as well. So this is the way to circumvent this war game suspension. Eventually, we bring back different exercises with no name, maybe with fewer people, maybe more computerized. There are alternatives.
So you mentioned about what's the use of maintaining a military if there's no exercise. Then my question is, if there is no joint exercises, then is this the signal, the first step to the ending of the military alliance between U.S. and South Korea?
Absolutely not, I hope. This is a very valuable alliance, and it has a long-term value for regional stability, for the interests of the Korean people, for the American people, that even transcends North Korea. But we are a long way from having permanent peace with North Korea, first of all. Secondly, China's emergence continues, and every country, even North Korea, would love to balance against China to some extent. So the United States retains some value here. Thirdly, we don't want to leave our other key ally in Northeast Asia, Japan, absolutely alone in terms of what's happening in Northeast Asia. So there are a lot of other reasons why this alliance will remain intact for a long time.
Patrick is absolutely right, but I am worried about something else that President Trump said in his press conference after the summit. He talked about wanting to remove U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula. Now, eventually, that might be part of a comprehensive, thorough peace treaty and real peace with North Korea. But to put it out there at the beginning, I think does undermine the alliance and undermines the credibility of America's staying power. The Japanese and the South Koreans are both worried about this kind of precipitous talk of withdrawal.
I'd rather see the South Koreans start to engage the North Koreans on confidence-building measures like removing the entrenched artillery that are in the Kaesong Heights. If you could pull those back, and maybe we'd have to pay for that, but pull those back from the DMZ, there could be those kind of confidence-building measures. Those things could precede real reduction of troops from the United States in particular.
So this freeze for freeze idea, freezing North Korea's testing to freezing of the joint military exercises, was actually China's idea in the beginning. So how would China react to this, and is this in the interest of the United States?
China's the big winner, actually, in the Singapore summit. They got this freeze for freeze, even though the United States certainly isn't calling that, but that's de facto what it is. But I think President Trump showed the way. You can start with the freeze for freeze, linked with this goal of denuclearization, and then get on with the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are de facto starting with a freeze for freeze, but we're not stopping there. And I think that's where Mike Pompeo has got the lead to try to figure out what we can get beyond that in relatively short order. So China's the winner tactically maybe right now, but let's remember that China just 3 months ago was scrambling to catch up with the diplomacy that was moving so fast.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today shows commuters in Pyongyang gather around the Rodong Sinmun newspaper, which carried full 4-page extensive coverage of the Singapore summit. Rodong Sinmun reported the two leaders agreed to phased and synchronous denuclearization process and portrayed Chairman Kim as setting the terms of the deal. Now, Patrick?
The big value of this press in North Korea is it's showing America in a positive light. After 65 years of hostility and America as the demon, now America is friendly. There's handshakes. This could be a major shift in North Korean thinking.
Well, I think this is indicative of what we need to watch. How will North Korea report the ongoing discussions, not just this summit meeting, but whether North Korea makes commitments to denuclearization? And as North Korea opens up in this process, if this process goes forward, what does that do to the legitimacy of the Kim family? What does that do to the society? Does it allow for a middle class to grow, or does it create political upheaval? And I think those will be very important trends to watch in the coming years.
On that very positive note, we'll end this conversation here. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Cronin, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Thank you for watching.